All right, guys, we are picking right back up the second part of chapter 16, section 5. If you're following along in your notes, we are now looking at what happens to Abraham Lincoln after the war. So, if you watched the last video, then the last part of the video, we're looking at, the video itself is the immediate effects of the Civil War. And that last slide, which would be slide 6 of the notes, slide 5 of the notes, we talked about the post-war career of Robert E. Lee, Ulysses Grant, Tecumseh Sherman, Jefferson Davis. That now that the war is over with, what happens to these major leaders of the Civil War? All right, so now we're going to talk about what happens to Abraham Lincoln. Now that the war is over with, Abraham Lincoln, the president of the United States, what happens to him? Abraham Lincoln was elected in 1860, which kind of set off the chain of events that took place to lead to the war. Lincoln was an abolitionist, but was not full-blown for complete freedom of slaves, not even complete equality between blacks and whites. However, South Carolina and many southern states saw the election of Lincoln as losing their political voice. And so that's what led to many of those states seceding. Lincoln will win re-election in 1864 during the war itself. So we didn't really talk about that last chapter, but in the presidential election of 1864, Abraham Lincoln is re-elected as president of the United States. So as the Civil War comes to an end, Lincoln is just now starting his second term as president of the United States. So what happens to Lincoln after the war? Well, not a whole lot, actually. Well, I take it back. A lot happens, but it's very short-lived, because just a couple of days after just a few days after the official surrender ending the war, Abraham Lincoln will be killed. He'll be shot and killed by a man named John Wilkes Booth. So that's what this video is going to be about today, is that we're going to look at the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, the plot to kill Lincoln, what it really meant, because it was more than just some angry man who shoots the president. There is a backstory to it, and the assassination of Lincoln is really going to lead to what happens next in regards to Reconstruction in the South. So let's get started looking at those that are involved in the plot itself. Okay, John Wilkes Booth was a Confederate actor from the South. He was very well known in many parts of the country, not only with Confederates but also with the United States. John Wilkes Booth was a regular at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. He was known to perform there many times. And many people knew who John Wilkes Booth was. It is believed that John Wilkes Booth came up with this assassination plot to kill Lincoln after a speech by Lincoln to end the Civil War. Again, keep in mind that Lincoln is assassinated 5 days after Robert E. Lee surrenders, very soon afterwards. And so all this takes place very quickly at the end of the war. So it is believed that John Wilkes Booth, after hearing upon the collapse of the Confederacy and the surrender of Robert E. Lee, just becomes filled with rage and comes up with this plot to kill Abraham Lincoln. And so that's where the plot begins. It begins with John Wilkes Booth in Washington, D.C., because, again, he is an actor. He had access to many of the theaters across state lines and across the Confederate U.S. lines. And so it was nothing new for John Wilkes Booth to be in what we would call Union territory. So John Wilkes Booth, along with 3 other men, will plan to assassinate Abraham Lincoln. Those 3 other men were Lewis Powell, David Harold, and George Atzerodt. So Powell, Harold, and Atzerodt will, with John Wilkes Booth, come up with the plan to assassinate Abraham Lincoln. But now, Abraham Lincoln was not the only one targeted. The entire plot here was also planned to kill Vice President Andrew Johnson and Secretary of State William Seward. So there were actually 3 men that were targeted here in the assassination plot: Abraham Lincoln, the Vice President, and the Secretary of State. Now, why the Secretary of State? Why would he be targeted? Well, first of all, Secretary of State is handling all war-related matters, all matters within um, um, domestic disputes at this point in time, and later on in regards to disputes outside of the United States as well. William Seward was also known as a pretty crude man towards the Confederacy, was known to be very outspoken against the Confederacy. And so as a result, he'll be targeted as well. So you're looking at really three of the top people of the entire U.S. government in all actuality. That if this thing is successful, you're talking about the president, vice president, the top two in regards to leaders of the country, as well as Secretary of State. You're looking at three of the top 4 or 5 men in the head of the U.S. government. And so it is believed that part of this assassination plot was to maybe bring down the U.S. government by killing off 3 of their top leaders. The plan itself was made at a boarding house in Washington, D.C. that was owned by Mary and John Surratt. Mary Surratt owned a boarding house, which was basically like it was like a hotel. Back in the days before, there were official hotels like we have today, there were boarding houses and things like that. And a boarding house would have been owned by a family that probably lived in the place itself, that might have, I guess the best way to describe it is kind of like a big house. It is a big house. You take in turn 2 or 3 or 4 of those rooms, and you rent it out like you would a hotel. So Mary Surratt owned this boarding house in Washington, D.C., where Booth, Powell, Harold, and Azarat were staying. And so it's believed that aside from the 4 men, that Mary and John Surratt were also part of this whole conspiracy plot. So that when this thing is all said and done, Mary and John Surratt would also be sought out as possible conspirators. So when the plan is made, the final plan here is that on April the 14th, the assassination plot is going to be put into action. 5 days after the surrender of Robert E. Lee at the Appomattox Courthouse. So the plan is made, it is finalized, it is put, and it is put into place. So as we get into the night of April 14th, 1865, and the plot comes into motion, we're going to, first of all, look at what happens with William Seward and President Johnson before we get to Lincoln. So Secretary of State William Seward was one of the men who were targeted in this whole assassination attempt. So the plan here is for Lewis Powell to be the one that targets William Seward. Okay, John Wilkes Booth was responsible for Abraham Lincoln. George Azarat is going to be the one responsible for assassinating the vice president. Lewis Powell is going to be the one responsible for assassinating William Seward. And the 4th man, David Harold, is going to be with George Powell. So Powell is going to break into William Seward's house, kill him, and then he goes back outside where David Harold is waiting with the horses, basically like a getaway car. And so George Powell finds his way into William Seward's house. And as he makes his way to William Seward's bedchambers, because Seward was in his bedroom at the time, Powell will attack one of the servants as well as William Seward's son as he makes his way up the stairs, and will break into William Seward's bedchambers. Now, William Seward had been recuperating from, I believe it was a surgery. He actually had some family members there in the bedroom with him. George Powell is going to break into Seward's bedchambers and will attack him several times. He will stab Seward multiple times in trying to kill him. William Seward's son hears what's going on, comes in to try to stop Lewis Powell, and he'll be attacked as well. So when it's all said and done, Lewis Powell will attack 4 different people in William Seward's home, 2 of his sons, a servant, and then William Seward himself. Amazingly enough, all 4 men survive the attack. Now, what happens with Powell is that Powell is going to run outside of Seward's house. He will meet up with David Harold, and they will both ride out of town to the rendezvous point. So the attack on Seward has happened. Seward has been stabbed multiple times, along with three other people in his house, but all of them survive. Powell is either one of the unluckiest guys in assassination history, or he just didn't know what he was doing. Of the four guys that he attacked, all four survived, including William Seward. Now, the thing that saved Seward's life was that he was wearing a contraption over his head, a metal contraption. And I can't remember exactly why he was wearing this, whether it was some kind of procedure that he had, or maybe it was a sleeping issue. Anyway, um, what happened was that as Powell came down with a knife to stab him, he was trying to stab him up in the upper region. As he came down, he hit that metal, kind of like a metal plate that was surrounding his head, and it stopped the knife from actually going in very far. And so, even though Seward was stabbed multiple times, the stab wounds never went deep enough to cause any major damage. So William Seward will survive this attack along with the other three men that's attacked as well. And as a result, Lewis Powell and David Harold are now on their way out of Washington, D.C. All right. So next is going to be Vice President Andrew Johnson. And the assassination of Johnson is going to come at the hands of George Atzerodt. So the plan here is that Vice President Johnson is going to be up in his room. Okay, he's not necessarily at a house. He has a room that is above, kind of like a bar area. If you think of maybe like a modern day hotel, that the bottom lobby layer has like a restaurant and a bar area, and then you have the rooms on top. That's pretty much what happened here. So Vice President Johnson is in one of these rooms, and George Atzerodt, as he makes his way into the facilities, is going to basically stop at the bar and will take a couple of drinks. Okay, Atzerodt was seen as being very, very nervous. Maybe has second thoughts about maybe going through with this. After all, he's about to kill the Vice President of the United States. And so he takes a couple of drinks to try to loosen his nerves a little bit, to try to take the edge off. And what happens is that he just keeps drinking and keeps drinking and keeps drinking until he finally gets drunk. And so as a result, George Atzerodt never goes through with the attack. Okay, he's too scared, he's too nervous, and then ends up getting drunk and trying to take the edge off. And so he never attacks Johnson. Johnson is never disturbed at all. Johnson is upstairs sleeping, and he is never disturbed until the news of the attacks come in. So George Atzerodt never even attempts to assassinate Johnson. So out of this assassination plot of Seward, Johnson, and Lincoln, as of right now, it's a complete failure. Yes, Seward is injured along with three other guys, but none of them die. Johnson is never even attacked. So these four men who have this assassination plot, so far, they're not very successful in doing so. It is a complete failure. All right. However, things are going to be a little bit different with Abraham Lincoln. All right. Things are Lincoln is not going to have the same fortune as William Seward and Andrew Johnson. And the man that's responsible for attacking Lincoln is going to be the main conspirator himself, John Wilkes Booth. So the plan for John Wilkes Booth is that he is going to take out Lincoln at a place called Ford's Theater. Ford's Theater was a theater in Washington, D.C. We have movie theaters, today, but before you had movie theaters, you would have theaters of live plays and operas and ballets. So the plan here is that Abraham Lincoln, on the night of April the 14th, was supposed to attend Ford's Theater to see the British comedy Our American Cousin. It was a running series there at Ford's Theater. That now that the war is over with, Abraham Lincoln can now relax. Now, just a little bit of a backstory here about Abraham Lincoln leading up to the attack. Abraham Lincoln was very, very stressed. It has been noted in the years past that Lincoln, the war had taken a big toll on Lincoln. He was very sickly looking. You could tell that he was very stressed. even as the war is over with, because just because the war is over with and you've won doesn't mean that everything is over with. Now you have to come up with a plan on how to rebuild the country. And now that is weighing heavily on Lincoln's mind. And that phase one is complete. We've won the war. Great. But now we've got to rebuild the country. Now we have to reunify the country and get everything back to normal. And so even though the war is over with, Lincoln has a lot of stress, and it is very obvious to a lot of people. And so Lincoln, it has been planned for Lincoln and his wife to go out for a night on the town to see this play. Matter of fact, Lincoln tries to back out. Lincoln says that he is tired, he doesn't feel very well, and so he doesn't want to go out on this evening. But his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, basically talks him into it. Basically says, "Look, you need to get out. You need to relax for a few hours." She can tell, everybody around Lincoln can tell that he is just beyond stressed. His health had deteriorated a good bit, and I don't know if necessarily I'd have to find a picture, but if you go and look at presidents through the years, an interesting thing to do is that, especially for presidents who serve for 2 terms, look at what the president looks like at the beginning of his first term and look at what he looks like at the end of that second term. Now, yeah, 8 years is a long time. However, it is a very eye-opening thing that when you look at presidents from year 1 to year 8, they just look older. And the latest one that we can look at that with is President Barack Obama. But look at Barack Obama and George W. Bush and Bill Clinton. Look at their pictures when they first became president, and then look at their pictures as their presidency is coming to an end. And you'll see that there is a lot more gray hair. Some cases, maybe even hair being lost. There are a lot more wrinkles in their face. And again, yes, I know that's 8 years of aging, but that's also 8 years of a lot of stress. Think about what all the president has to go through, whether it's Trump, whether it's Obama, whoever it is, all the issues that they had to go through. They don't get, a good 8, 9, 10 hours of sleep per night. It is constant stress. Even when you're on vacation, you're having to be the leader of the country. And so there is a natural aging process that goes along with that. But people had, there have been reports over the years that from 1861 to 1865, Lincoln aged maybe 10 years. It was very visible that the man was sick, that the man was in pretty bad health. Not that he was dying that we know of, but it was because of stress of the war. And so I say that to say this, okay? Mary Todd Lincoln is going to talk Abraham Lincoln into going to the play that night. He doesn't want to, doesn't feel like it, but she says, you need to get out of the White House. You need to have just a good, relaxed evening. And so they're going to go to Ford's Theater that night to watch the play Our American Cousin, which is a comedy. Now, Abraham Lincoln and Mary Todd Lincoln are supposed to go with another couple. Originally, that was going to be Ulysses Grant. Ulysses Grant, who was the commanding general of the Union forces to end the war. He was a war hero, and he's going to have a very lucrative career after the war, was personally invited by Abraham Lincoln to join him for the play that night. However, Grant had other plans. He had to decline the offer because he was going to go see his sister. And the president is going to invite several other people who, notable people of the government who just turns him down because they have other things going on. They do end up going along with another couple, a Union major known as Rathbone. And I'm going to look up his first name here. Henry Rathbone, who is a U.S. military officer at the end of the war, a notable major of the U.S. Army. And so that's the plan. Lincoln and his wife are going to go with Henry Rathbone and his wife for what should be a stress-free night on the town. So that's what happens. They make it to the theater. Lincoln, his wife, Rathbone, his wife, are in the president's box watching the play, having a good night. Well, just before 10 p.m., or sorry, just after 10 p.m., John Wilkes Booth is going to put his plan into action. At this point, the play is well into the full production. And I know that 10 p.m. sounds pretty late, but that was pretty normal time for this time period. That you're pretty much deep into the play to where nobody's getting up and going anywhere. Everybody's in their seats, guaranteed that the president is going to be in his box. So John Booth enters the theater just after 10 p.m. And as he goes through the hallways and the lobby, he'll pass by fans, he'll pass by theater spectators, he'll even pass by Union soldiers. And nobody stops him. Why? Why does nobody stop John Wilkes Booth? He passes Union soldiers. He passes people who recognizes him in the lobby, because keep in mind that he was a famous actor. People knew who he was. So why wasn't he stopped as he walked into the theater? Well, there's no reason to stop him. He hasn't done anything wrong yet, or at least not that they know of. And also, it was very common for actors to kind of go back and forth. Even during the day when there wasn't a play going on, it was very common for actors to go into the theater and to walk around and to congregate and to talk to people. That was nothing out of the ordinary. So just because people recognize John Wilkes Booth here as he enters the theater, they have no idea that anything is going on. It is very common for him to be there. Maybe he's watching the play himself. And so nobody stops John Wilkes Booth because, frankly, there's no reason to stop him. So John Wilkes Booth makes his way up to the hallway leading to Lincoln's box. Now, this is where things get a little shaky, because Booth can enter the theater and he can go through the lobby, but getting to Abraham Lincoln's personal box that he's sitting in is going to be another story. So John Wilkes Booth makes his way to the hallway that leads to President Lincoln's box. And the guard is not there. Okay, there was a guard, a Union soldier, who was supposed to be guarding the box to make sure that nobody entered. Well, the guard is not there. He's missing. Now, accounts later on told us that the guard was actually across the street at the bar getting himself a drink. And believe it or not, he's supposed to be protecting the president, and instead he is across the street getting himself a drink. Now, this sounds pretty shaky, and we'll get back into the conspiracy theories here in just a minute. But for John Wilkes Booth, the one man that can stop him, the guard that's standing at outside of the box, is not there. So as a result, he opens the door and enters the hallway that goes down to Lincoln's box. So kind of how this is set up here is that if you can imagine this, you have Abraham Lincoln's box here, his press box where he is sitting. There's a door that goes from the box into the hallway, and at the end of the hallway is another door. Okay, so John Wilkes Booth has just entered the first door to go into the hallway that leads straight to his booth. He will take a music stand and basically prop the door closed to where nobody can enter. Well, again, you might say, well, it's pretty coincidental. How in the world is there a music stand in a hallway? Well, as we go back and look at the details of the attack, then we have found evidence that John Wilkes Booth, in the hours leading up to the attack on the day of April the 14th, set all this up. Okay, again, John Wilkes Booth was an actor. It was very common for him to be in the theater at any point in time. And nobody thought any different because, again, if there's not any evidence to suggest that he's doing anything illegal or that's shaky, there's no reason to stop him. So leading up to the attack, John Wilkes Booth had already been in the theater that day to set all this up. He's the one that put the music stand there in the hallway because he knew that he was going to need it to prop the door open. He pretty much staked out the place so that as he made his way to Lincoln, everything is exactly where he should be. Okay, so John Wilkes Booth opens the door to enter the hallway that goes into Lincoln's box, takes the music stand, blocks the door so that nobody can go through. At that point, there's nobody that can stop him except for Lincoln and Rathbone themselves. So he makes his way down the hallway to the door that leads into the box. And there was a little hole that was cut out to where John Wilkes Booth could actually look in that hole through the door and see exactly where Lincoln is. Again, he's staking out the place. Now, there have been a lot of conspiracy theorists to say that John Wilkes Booth earlier in the day. Again, he set all this up, and that he took his knife and that he carved out that little hole to where he could see through. That's actually not true. Um, the hole there in the door was actually something that had already been there. That was a way for Lincoln's bodyguards to look in on him. Okay, Lincoln was a regular at Ford's Theater, and so the hole that was in the door was actually there for security reasons, so that the security guard could look in from time to time to make sure that Lincoln and everybody was okay. For John Wilkes Booth, is going to be a gift for him because he can now look and see exactly where Lincoln is, so that as he enters the booth, he knows where he needs to go. And that's what he does. Okay, he opens the door quietly. He sneaks into the booth. Nobody sees him because they're focused on the play itself. Now, John Wilkes Booth is his cue to attack Lincoln is going to be a line called "You sick, dologizing old man trap." Now, these words mean nothing to us, but back during this time period, it was one of these one-line quips to where it was supposed to produce laughter. It was a funny line, and this was John Wilkes Booth's cue to stab Lincoln. That when they said this, and everybody burst into laughter, that's when the attack happens, and that's exactly what happens. The line is said, "You sick, dologizing old man trap." Booth takes his pistol, puts it in the back of Lincoln's head, and as everybody begins to laugh, he pulls the trigger and he shoots Lincoln in the back of the head. Now, obviously, for Major Rathbone, who is there next to Lincoln, he is going to try to defend himself. Okay, so John Wilkes Booth will take his knife and he will stab Major Rathbone. So the two men in the box are now critically injured. Booth cannot go back the way that he came in. He cannot go back down the hallway because he knows that people are coming. So what he does is that he goes to the edge of the booth, which is just above the stage area, and he jumps from the booth, which is pretty much 2 stories up, on down to the stage, and he's going to run at the stage. Now, there is a rumor that as John Wilkes Booth jumped down to the stage, he yelled out, "Sic semper tyrannis," which translates into "Thus it be ever to tyrants." And then reportedly he yells out, "The South is avenged." Now, he did yell out "Sic semper tyrannis." Okay, he yelled out, "Thus it be ever to tyrants," to the people in the theater. But there's not really any concrete evidence to say that the South is avenged. Okay, that's one of those floating theories over the years, but we don't really know whether or not he said it. Regardless, Lincoln's been shot in the back of the head. Major Henry Rathbone is stabbed in the process, and now John Wilkes Booth is running out of the theater, and he is now on the run of his life. So, when we look at the assassination plot, William Seward, Andrew Johnson, Abraham Lincoln, all 3 attempts have now been followed through. William Seward is in critical condition. Andrew Johnson doesn't even know anything's going on, and now Abraham Lincoln has been shot in the back of the head, and now the race is on to try to save Lincoln's life. Lincoln's body is going to be taken across the street to what's called the Peterson House. It was right across the street, and Abraham Lincoln is in critical condition. Okay, he's been shot in the back of the head at point blank range. He is still alive. He still has a pulse, but he's in really, really bad shape. The doctors will do everything that they can, but when it comes down to it, there's nothing that they can do. Okay, Lincoln is losing blood. He's going to die. He got brain damage. He's not going to come out of this. It's only a matter of time before he stops breathing. And that happens at 7:22 in the morning of April 15th. So he is shot a little after 10 p.m. on April the 14th. About 7 hours later, about 9 hours later, Abraham Lincoln will die on April the 15th, 1865. In doing so, becomes the first U.S. president to ever be assassinated. So becomes the first U.S. president to ever be assassinated. Now, he's not the first one to ever die in office, but he's the first one to ever be killed in office. On April the 21st, Abraham Lincoln's body will leave Washington, D.C. His body will be on display there at the rotunda of the Capitol building, as is the tradition. And then we'll board a train on April the 21st to go back to Illinois, where he will be buried. Okay, Abraham Lincoln was from Illinois, and so his body will be taken from D.C. to Illinois to be buried. Now, there's an interesting little side story to this, and there's a picture to go along with it. that as Abraham Lincoln's body or the train carrying his body is going from town to town, basically people line up like a parade to see the president's casket going back to be buried. And there is a future president that, as a little boy, saw his casket. Theodore Roosevelt, or Teddy Roosevelt, was a little boy in New York, and actually saw President Lincoln's casket as it went through. Now, Teddy Roosevelt will later on, about 40 years later, will be president of the United States. Abraham Lincoln will be laid to rest on May 4th, 1865, in Springfield, Illinois, and Andrew Johnson takes over as president. So now that the attack has happened, Abraham Lincoln is dead. Now we have to figure out where these men are and bring them to justice. Andrew Johnson wasn't even attacked. William Seward is in critical condition, but he will survive. And so now the race is on to find these men. And it will be up to not only Vice President Johnson, but Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. Now, Edwin Stanton was the Secretary of War. And for some reason, Stanton was not targeted in the attack. Stanton was very anti-Confederacy. He was very crude himself, but for some reason was not targeted in the attack. And it is Edwin Stanton that's going to lead charge to track down the men that killed Lincoln and that attacked William Seward. Now, for John Wilkes Booth, he will be tracked to a tobacco farm in Virginia, and Union soldiers will surround the barn. John Wilkes Booth, who has suffered a broken leg when he jumped from the president's booth down onto the stage at Forest Theater, he got caught on a flag and landed awkwardly and broke his leg. And so John Wilkes Booth was trying to escape with a broken leg. He was very badly wounded. He refuses to come out. So the Unions set the barn on fire to try to draw him out. Booth comes out blazing with guns. He'll be shot and he'll be killed. So John Wilkes Booth, the primary conspirator here, will be killed. In regards to David Harold, Lewis Powell, and George Azarat, they will all be arrested a few days after. And then they will be convicted of conspiracy and sentenced to death. But it's not just these four men. Mary Surratt is also arrested. Mary Surratt, who, if you keep in mind, owned the boarding house where the plot was planned. So you have John Wilkes Booth, David Harold, Lewis Powell, George Azarat, and Mary Surratt was arrested as well because they believed that she was in on the plan, or at least knew of the plan. Her son, John Surratt, was also targeted as well, but John Surratt is going to leave the country. Okay, John Surratt was a wanted man that was potentially a part of this conspiracy, but he will actually escape to Canada. So John Wilkes Booth is shot to death. He does not surrender. The other four, Harold, Powell, Azarat, and Mary Surratt, will all be found guilty of conspiracy, and they will be sentenced to death and will be hung on July 7th, 1865. And in doing so, Mary Surratt becomes the first woman to ever be executed by the United States government. Okay, not the first woman ever hung or executed, but the first woman executed by orders of the U.S. government. Now, whether or not Mary Surratt knew about what was going on, the proof still remains to exist. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that she at least knew about it, but whether or not she was one of the conspirators, I don't know if there's any proof out there to support that. Regardless, she will be killed. There are several others that will also be arrested along with the conspiracy. Edward Spangler, Michael O'Laughlin, Samuel Arnold, and Samuel Mudd, along with John Surratt as well. Those four men will also be arrested for harboring and helping these fugitives to escape. They will not be put to death. Instead, they will be sentenced to life with hard labor. So they will spend life in prison with hard labor. John Surratt eventually will be captured, and he will have justice as well. So the conspiracy plot to kill Abraham Lincoln, when all is said and done, Lincoln is dead. Johnson is never even attacked. Edwin, William Seward will survive his injuries. All of the ones involved, Booth, Harold, Powell, Azarat, will all be killed. Mary Surratt, as well as John Surratt, are co-conspirators. And then 4 other men, Spangler, O'Laughlin, Arnold, and Mudd, are convicted to life in prison as a result of all this. Now, before I wrap this up, I do want to talk a little bit about some of the conspiracy theories, because we know what's been proven, but over the years there have been a lot of conspiracy theories as to if there's anybody else involved. For example, is it a coincidence that Vice President Johnson wasn't attacked? Okay, he wasn't even attacked. Was that coincidence? Why was Edwin Stanton not targeted? Okay, everybody knew that he was very anti-Confederate, and if this was an attack to kind of avenge the South, then why was Stanton not targeted? There are a lot of conspiracy theorists that believe that Johnson was involved, that believe that Stanton was involved, and that maybe there were others that involved as well to try to get rid of Lincoln. That maybe Lincoln was the actual target here, and in order to cover that up, Johnson and Seward were also targeted. Now, again, there is no evidence to support that whatsoever. For an interesting story, an interesting debate. Think last year we talked about the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, and we did the debates last year. There are so many conspiracy theories, and what actually happened to Kennedy? Supposedly he was shot and killed by Lee Harvey Oswald, and that was it. But there are so many conspiracies out there. You're talking about 50, 60 years later, what actually happened? And the same thing exists for Abraham Lincoln. Again, do we know the whole story? Is it as simple as this? Is there more to it? Again, there's no concrete evidence to support that, but it does make for good conversation. So, was Johnson in on it? Was Stanton in on it? There's no evidence to support it, but it is part of the conspiracy theories. All right. So next time around, we're going to get into what's called Reconstruction. In that now that the war is over, we have to rebuild the country, we have to rebuild the South. And so with the next video, we'll talk about how that takes place.